So let's see. You survived your first exam, and we went over the exam last week for office hours, making sure that the sound is on this thing before I try to record. Oh, somebody is listening to music outside. So we went over the exam. I'm going to upload that review um, document record to Avenue, but not to YouTube. And then I will record this lecture as well. I'm going to set up my timer so that I don't go too far over on the lecture today. Let's see, stopwatch. Yeah, we'll start the stopwatch right now. So let's see, we are going to try to plow through the remaining component of the aggression and dominance lecture. It feels a little bit strange that it's been a week since I gave one of these things, or more than a week since I gave one of these lectures, because you had reading week. I guess I'm not supposed to give you content during reading week. There are no classes during reading week. Anyway, so we're talking about in the last lecture that dominance hierarchies are complex cognitive problems for the members of these animal societies. So living in a social group, so assessing an opponent's quality is already a challenging mental attribute for an animal. Being able to, for an animal to remember its own quality, how strong it is relative to other combatants, and then evaluate the specific performance attributes, the RHP, of the focal opponent is a cognitive challenge for animals. And they have to then sort of equilibrate their own fighting potential relative to the fighting potential of others. In dominance hierarchies in animal societies, you have many, many, many rivals that you're sort of contending with simultaneously, and you're trying to jockey for a position of higher rank inside of these societies so that you can enjoy more resources or greater reproductive output or reduced stress, et cetera, et cetera. In dominance hierarchies, you don't have to just attend to your quality and the quality of one opponent, but you have to try to remember the RHPs, aka the fighting potential and social statuses of many individuals inside of your society. And then presumably, if you get into conflicts not in dyadic interactions with one opponent against you and then one focal individual, but in group scenarios where I have a set of allies, my opponents have a set of allies, or I have a family group and they have a family group inside of our larger society, when you launch an attack and whether or not it's wise to do so has to take into account the RHP of you, the RHP of your opponent, the RHP of your allies on both sides, and then try to do the mathematics and the optimality problem of figuring out whether or not you should even attempt a coup or not, or when you should give up, right? And how much higher is this other group than you in terms of the social status? I mean, there are a lot of interesting sorts of mathematical economics type problems that these brains inside of animal societies have evolved, hypothetically, to solve. And so no shocker, there are lots of hypotheses that articulate that animals inside of highly elaborate animal societies, individual animals, should be more intelligent. So the social intelligence hypothesis basically just says that living in a society is complicated, having lots of other individuals around you is complicated, remembering who they are, what they're capable of, your relationship with them, who's been fulfilling their social obligations, who has been derelict, and acting accordingly is a complex series of challenges. And so social animals should be more intelligent than non-social animals. Simple hypothesis. The Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis takes a somewhat darker view and basically says like, it's deceit. It's the ability to lie to your opponents and make it seem like you're helping, make it seem like you're going to assist them, make it seem like you don't mean them any harm, but then cryptically be swindling them out of resources the whole time, knifing them in the back, and hopefully cryptically, and remembering all these diabolical things you can do to them that favors greater intelligence. Those two hypotheses, the social intelligence hypothesis and the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, are very, very similar. It's just one tends to focus on like the villainy of living in an animal society. That is the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. And one is sort of agnostic to whether or not it's, you know, villainous, deceitful attributes or just the mathematics and accounting of living in a society with lots of combatants, lots of rivals that favors enhanced intelligence. All right, and oh gee, what do you know? If you look at neocortex volume relative to group size, what do you see? You see that, yes, animal species or primate species that have large group sizes tend to have disproportionately larger neocortex ratios. This provides some circumstantial evidence that living in groups and living in large complex groups, if you assume that like the mathematical problems of figuring out your rank in a society increases when there's more individuals to memorize around you, favors more elaborate neuroanatomy and possible learning potential. There are a lot of assumptions with this, like, does a neocortex ratio actually correspond to greater intelligence? And is it the kind of intelligence that helps you in a society, or is it associated with parental care, or is it associated with the length of mother-offspring bonds, or is it associated with other features that might have co-evolved with group size? Is group size really the causal element, and is this the kind of intelligence that specifically favors social problems or not? Lots of other things are positively associated with grouping, right? So social tolerance is also positively associated with the extent of allomaternal care. So maybe it has nothing to do with living in a large complex group, but just remembering how to attend to your offspring and for longer periods of time. Maybe that is what fosters the evolution of greater learning potential. Or maybe that, which is correlated with the evolution of sociality, is actually the driving force for enhanced intelligence, if in fact that's evolving in response to either of these features. The problem is all of these things move forward in an evolutionary way, in a constellation sometimes, and so you don't really know which attribute is causing the evolution, adaptive evolution of other attributes, or if it's adaptive at all, right? So nobody knows. And we don't have experimental histories of primate evolution to try to like finally manipulate what the ancestral character state was, and or allow some traits to evolve but not others. We can't go back in time and decipher this. We only have one tree of life to leverage. And so these are neat hypotheses, but they're difficult to critically evaluate in a way that's satisfying. So one thing that's important is like not all kinds of animal societies are equally complex. So like primate societies, large primate societies and large primate societies that have extended allomaternal care, mothers rearing offspring that are not necessarily their own, other maternal mother care. So like having aunts is what allomaternal care means, by the way. All right, so but those primate societies, they're really weird. Primates, you and I, we are strange animals. Cooperative breeders, a different kind of animal society, like these banded mongoose here. I think it's a mongooses, but I like mongoose better. Anyway, so these banded mongoose here, they're dumb. In fact, most cooperatively breeding mammals are no smarter than their closely related non-cooperative breeding related species. So these banded mongoose, although they live in giant societies where there's there's allomaternal care and they're cooperative breeding, or meerkats, which are famous cooperative breeders. These are both kinds of social mongoose. Meerkats are also kind of social mongoose. So you would imagine maybe they would have enhanced intelligence. No evidence for that. Across all of the animal kingdom, cooperative breeders are no more intelligent than their non-cooperative sister taxa or related taxa. So living in a cooperative breeding society, at least in mammals, appears to have no enhanced association with greater intelligence. So for cooperative breeders, social intelligence and Machiavellian intelligence doesn't seem to matter at all. These things are just as dumb as every other mammal. All right, deer enemy dynamics. So you would imagine like figuring out who your opponents are and then changing your behavior through time as you become familiar with them should be a cognitively difficult thing for animals to do, but it turns out that that's incredibly common. So deer enemy dynamics, even when the animals don't live in animal societies, like in a cooperative structure, like cooperative breeders or eusociality or allomaternal societies, even animals that are just solitary and territorial oftentimes memorize their opponents, or at least learn something about who they are, who their common opponents are, and adjust their behavior accordingly. Enter the deer enemy dynamic. So the deer enemy hypothesis basically just says that evolution should favor individuals that reduce the cost of fighting and aggression with familiar individuals, their neighbors, or group mates, right? So basically just you, or like, let's pretend you're this little redback salamander here. Redback salamanders are incredibly adorable. Oh, Jesus. Are incredibly adorable. Here they are. And so males and females pair bond in Plethodon cinereus. That's this redback salamander here. And they maintain a little territory, usually beneath like a rock or underneath some sphagnum moss or underneath a log. And these things occur in temperate deciduous forests from like Pennsylvania down to like northern Georgia. Anyway, so at the peak of their densities, they can have something like, I don't know, many dozens of individuals in little pair bonds, every meter squared in nice habitats. Cool. And they defend these little territories that they mark with chemosensory like a grease that they produce from a gland beneath their throat. So the males and the females make a little territory together, they set it up, and then they defend that little sub-territory that they have from intrusion. So if some other male or some other female that is not part of this pair bond wanders into the territory of this focal pair here, mortal combat ensues, and the local residents will attack these invaders. These invasions can be quite costly, and these fights can be quite costly because one of the strategies that these Plethodon use against their opponents is they try to take their little teeth, which is like a little ridge, and they try to rake them across the volar nasal organ, which is like a chemosensory groove on the nose of these salamanders, and rake their teeth across that volar nasal organ. That's a problem because if your opponent scrapes your volar nasal organ, these salamanders, they use that weird groove on their nose to taste their world. It's basically like a really sensitive tongue that goes across the top of their head along their nose, a little divot. And they can tell where they are, whether they're at home or whether they're in somebody else's territory, using that groove. If that groove is compromised, they can't really tell where they are. They can't tell where home is. They can't tell if they're in somebody else's territory, if that territory is occupied or not. They can't find food. And so if you have your volar nasal organ scraped by an opponent severely in one of these interactions, you can wander around for the rest of your little Plethodon days, and you have a long metabolism. You have a slow metabolism, so it's a long life, lost, unable to find food, serially attacked by resident owners until you basically starve to death, wandering around, right? No one wants that to happen. So they want to avoid fighting whenever it's superfluous, right? So if a rival's coming in to mate with your female, or a rival's coming in to mate with your male and extirpate you, sure, attack them. But the problem is these salamanders reach such high densities that there are going to be occasional accidents where neighbors who have no interest in actually supplanting you from your territory just kind of bumble in, right? Even though there's little territories, even though they're scent marked, and even though you have your intact volar nasal organ, individuals just stumble into other territories on accident sometimes. And so these Plethodon have evolved a dear enemy phenomenon where they can tell the chemosensory tastes of their most common neighbors. So I have this territory, you have that territory, and through our development, I will learn who my neighbors are and suppress my aggression towards them. So my neighbors, my dear enemy, as in like my opponent, but it's an opponent that I'm familiar with, I will tend to have a reduced level of aggression towards because their presence doesn't really mean that they're here to throw me out because they're here somewhat regularly. I know who they are. However, conversely, is if you taste somebody's chemosensory exuvia in your territory and their slime basically, and they're not familiar, well, that's much more threatening because they're not a normal neighbor. They could be here to supplant you. They could mean to take your female, take your male, take your foraging rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, your cover object, whatever these things hold dear in their territories. And so you exhibit heightened levels of aggression towards those individuals because they could mean you harm. So dear enemy phenomenon, you habituate. You become desensitized to your neighbors. You might not recognize their individual scents, but perhaps because you're in adjacent territories, you have similar kinds of food. So you can taste by the slime that this is a local individual. You might not know that individuals A, B, C, and D occupy these territories around you, but you might know that all the individuals in this immediate territory have a similar kind of slime. That means that they're from this area, and so I tolerate them. But if they have a slime that's unlike my slime, which means they may have come from a hill 3 meters away, then that is foreign and I should attack that. So you don't even have to have individual recognition to get the dear enemy hypothesis to get off the ground. You just have to be able to basically have familiar and unfamiliar bins mentally and be able to bin things that are familiar to you in one category, or use some heuristic to bin them all together, like similarity in slime to your own, or, which is, would be environmentally influenced, or you could have individual recognition. Like, I actually know who my individual neighbors are and I'm nice to them, comparatively nice to them, and more aggressive towards individuals that I'm not familiar with. But it could be a simpler heuristic. So all you need is habituation for this and binning of like and unlike, or familiar and unfamiliar, to get this phenomenon to happen. And this occurs all over the animal kingdom. It occurs at the level of individuals, like these salamanders, or in not eusocial, but in pair bonding mole rats. It occurs probably in human societies, and it occurs in whole collectives as well. So this is a desert leaf-cutting ant, and they have it on the order of colonies, right? So colonies of these ants maintain territories where they collect plant material from around their immediate vicinity, take it back to their into their colony, and then they grow a fungus that they eat, that the ants eat. So they make a little garden out of this chewed up, spat all over plant pulp. And they live in a desert where actually getting that plant pulp is challenging. And sometimes getting the right kinds of plants isn't assured. And other colonies might try to encroach on plants that are near you to steal that resource away from you. So these acromyrmex will defend their foraging territory, their foraging paths around their giant colonies. But they also learn who the acromyrmex colonies are that are in adjoining spaces. So that if you present this focal colony here next to this gentleman, these are in Argentina, I think. If you present them with workers from a nearby colony, even if it's unrelated as a colony, but a nearby colony that those workers interact with all the time, they're not as aggressive as if you presented them with individuals of workers from faraway colonies. And the hypothesis is that this proximity could be the result of a dear enemy phenomena, a cost savings economical decision that you should just not have heightened levels of aggression towards groups that are adjoining yours, because you're going to interact with them all the time. Yes, you defend your territory. Yes, you still mount an assault, but it doesn't have to be as aggressive of a response. So maybe the colony deploys fewer workers to the attack, but just sort of a small number to make it clear that a small skirmish is all that's necessary to make it clear you want that foraging territory for yourself and not the opposing colony. But if it's a foreign colony, then like heads up, that could spell danger for you if it's unfamiliar. So could it happen within groups? So it could happen within groups. So even within a highly integrated social group, you can imagine like, you know who your common opponents are and you suppress your level of aggression towards them. Would make sense. But then also, what if the individuals that you tend to fight with are the ones that are immediately above or below you in rank, right? The ones that you're most likely to be able to supplant, or that might supplant you from your position in this dominance hierarchy. Well, if those are your most common opponents, maybe you should exhibit the highest level of aggression towards them, because they are the ones that you could supplant and gain from shoving down the ranks, or that might imperil you. So within a highly integrated society, you can imagine, yes, it could be advantageous to suppress your level of aggression towards familiar individuals. But you could also imagine the opposite, like you develop a bad relationship with the individuals around you in terms of ranks, and you actually behave more aggressively towards them because they're the ones that imperil you the most, or that you can gain the most by imperiling. Anyway, in human relationships, it's not uncommon that individuals that iteratively get into spats with each other actually have a lower threshold to fight each other in the future, i.e. they're more likely to hurt each other, to escalate, to come to fisticuffs. But yeah, it could go either way. No one really knows how these things play out internally. Okay, how much information is there actually inside of a hierarchy? So these animal hierarchies can have hundreds or thousands of individuals, or at least many dozens of individuals, depending on the species and the exact natural history. And so the question then becomes, do you have to memorize all these individuals? Do you have to memorize who the highest ranking individuals are, and then the second highest ranking, and then the third highest ranking, and then act accordingly? And how do you know what an animal knows about its position in a hierarchy? Do you know who the individuals are who are immediately beneath you? Do you know everyone is beneath you, it's beneath you in this ranking system is all one category, or what goes on here? So how much do individuals know about their social positions? Well, the animals can't tell you what they know. They don't self-report, they don't take exams, and except for a small number of like primates and a small number of birds, they don't like even play interesting video games or anything that would allow you to decipher their cognitive performance or what they're really capable of in sort of a contrived way. So what do you have to do? You have to use indirect evidence. So you have to watch with who they deploy their aggressiveness towards, where they focus their attacks when they do contest rank inside of this, inside of these dominance hierarchies, and that tells you something about what these animals know, at least hypothetically. It's the best we can do. All right, so there are three commonly proposed knowledge schemes inside of dominance hierarchies. By the way, like gray wolves are famous for having a very well-characterized dominance hierarchy of alphas, betas, deltas, omegas, etc. And then they even have division of labor associated with these positions in the pack. At least these things tend to have the following tasks that they tend to do. And anyway, if you want to memorize what gray wolves do based on their position in the dominance hierarchy, there it is. But the three most common kinds of aggression that we see are either A, the downwards heuristic, where you always direct your aggression at anyone beneath you in the chain. You don't necessarily know who's a little bit beneath you in the chain or way beneath you in the chain, but you know that you can attack those individuals and there's basically no consequence for it. Then there's the second option, B, the pure close competitor approach, which is that you know who your direct rivals and threats are. So opportunities and threats. Who could you potentially supplant who's just in front of you? Yeah, the individuals who are way above you in rank, presumably they have way higher RHP than you. So you should not waste your time fighting with them. But if they're just slightly in front of you, then maybe you got a chance to throw the dice and be able to supplant them. Likewise, if they're way beneath you in the dominance hierarchy, then presumably you have much higher RHP than they do. And so why direct any aggression towards them versus if they're a threat just beneath you, then presumably the difference between your RHP and theirs is small or absent, or maybe the dominance hierarchy has it wrong, and actually they have a little more RHP than you. Well, how do you keep that at bay? Well, you just nip them in the ear every so often. You just let them know, like, hey, you're beneath me in this rank, and I'm going to direct some aggression towards you to let you know that I'm still trying to hold this rank above you, even if it's subtle, and maybe try to swindle my way into being one rank higher with individuals that are directly ranked just above me. So pure close competitors is basically like holding your position and threatening the individual in front of you. And then bullying, and that is that everybody in the dominance hierarchy really only deploys their aggression to individuals that are far below them in rank, so the bottom of the society receive almost all of the aggression directed towards them. Kind of a miserable notion. Like, these things have lower HP, they're beaten up all the time, and animal societies do this. Children, human children, do this all the time. It's actually a way that people sort of develop a sense of social camaraderie. Is you find a target that you share in common and you mob it together. People love this psychologically. Good God, look at Twitter. Twitter's making millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars off of this phenomenon. Anyway, that's a soapbox for another day. All right, so in real life, out of all the animals on Earth where we have really nice dominance hierarchies, 63% of them have a downwards heuristic, which is just anyone who's beneath you, whether they're a little bit or way beneath you, you just beat them up. So if you're at the top, yeah, you beat individuals that are betas, you beat individuals that are omegas, you attack those individuals, blah, 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 but you just sort of evenly distribute your aggression towards anyone beneath you, whether they're a little bit or a lot. You just know who's beneath you, basically. And that's all they appear to know. 16% of them, of animal societies, have a close competitor approach. That's 1/4 of the magnitude of that downwards heuristic. So the downwards heuristic explains almost all of it. or at least almost 2/3 of all the dominance hierarchies in the animal kingdom. 16% of them have close competitors. They nip at the heels of the individuals in front of them, and then they just beat down the individuals just behind them, just so they like trying to slowly adjust their way up the social dominance hierarchy ladder of life, one rung at a time, while trying to peck down the individuals who try to supplant you. And then 13%, a comparable frequency, are bullying societies, where it really is just the have-nots of society that get beaten down all the time. And then only 3% of animal societies, a computer can't tell what the heuristic is because it just appears to be totally gobbledygook. So perhaps there's no dominance hierarchies at all. All right, so downwards heuristic, which is that idea that you just attack anyone who's lower than you and you bend them all as the same thing, are most animal societies. And so red kangaroos have these silver eyes, or these little birds right here, American bison, lots of different kinds of animals. And it's interesting that even though these things are clearly not closely related, right? They have not shared an evolution, a common ancestor in millions and millions of years, sometimes hundreds of millions of years. And yet they have a very similar kind of way of directing aggression in the context of their dominance hierarchies. And that says that there's some level of parallelism across the animal kingdom. The fact that 63% of animal societies have this structure, even though it's independently evolved, suggests that it's a relatively efficient mechanism of sorting out a dominance hierarchy without having too many internal calculations that have to be figured out. Just bin all the ones beneath you into one giant bin. All right, close competitors. Monk parakeets, which are like these invasive parakeets that are all over the world now. They're common in Florida, actually. I was in St. Pete earlier this week. I guess it was yesterday, and I saw a bunch of monk parakeets beating the crap out of each other over like a hot dog stand or something. Anyway, so monk parakeets, they figured out who their direct rivals are beneath them and their direct opportunities are in front of them to supplant, and they tend to focus their aggression just on those immediate individuals around them in the dominance hierarchy. Mandrills are basically a fancy schmancy kind of baboon that are quite beautiful looking on the right-hand side here. And mandrills, at least some troops of mandrills, have a close competitor heuristic. So some of the troops that are studied clearly have this attack the ones just in front of you, attack the ones just behind you sort of organizational scheme. But not every troop that's been studied has that structure. The same thing happens with some feral horse populations. So wild horses seem to have a close competitive structure, but it's not all the time. It depends on the specific group of horses, the specific herd. Bullying. Bonobos, those highly sexed monkeys that are not that closely related to you, but have lots of non-Puritan sexual interactions that I would love to talk about in this course, but there's just not enough time. Anyway, so like if you get bored, just go look up YouTube videos about like, I don't know, true biology of bonobo monkeys, and it's fascinating. Anyway, so bonobos, depicted in the top right-hand corner here, are famous bullies. So they just have the lowest ranking individual society they beat the crap out of. European badgers in the bottom right-hand corner here, very cute looking, actually very pretty. I feel like this is like, they're almost on like golf sod here. Anyway, so they also oftentimes use a bullying heuristic in some groups, but not others. Spotted hyena is the same thing. And as I've already articulated, the individual group that you study, even though it's the same species, if you look at two replicate societies, the same species, they can be using a totally different kind of structure, right? So along the x-axis here, we have, okay, so up and down in each row is are the various kinds of societies studied, just a subset of them, and a giant review that I think just got published last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And then there are dots to the right of these names. The gray dots are individual social groups that appear to exhibit the downward heuristic. The pink dots are individual social groups of that species that had a close competitor heuristic. And then the blue dots are the bullying ones. So like if you look at the African elephant, the Loxodon africana, the second row here, you have most of the groups that have that downward heuristic. But then you had one of these groups of elephants, which I've forgotten what they're called. Are they a troop of elephants? Pride of lions. Herd of elephants? I guess just a herd of elephants. Maybe that's a Magic the Gathering card. I don't know. Anyway, so yes, one of these groups actually had a close competitor heuristic and one of them had a bullying heuristic. And the neat thing about that is that different societies of the same species just like human societies can have different social organizational structures. Even though they always have a matriarch and they always have a knowledgeable matriarch and they always have extended allomaternal care and blah, 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 there are cultural differences in how they organize their aggressiveness in the context of their dominance hierarchies. All of these species have dominance hierarchies. All of them have relatively well-formed dominance hierarchies, but how they direct their aggression within them can be totally different between groups. Why is that? Some groups have a close competitor heuristic versus a downwards heuristic versus bullying. No one knows. It's a hypothesis that's never been evaluated. Maybe it's transient, right? You can imagine that that some social groups after they've experienced stress or after they've changed locations, that they might change from one way of directing their aggression within a social dominance hierarchy to another. We have no idea. We have no idea how these things change through time, why they vary between groups, but the important thing is to note that even within a single species, different social groups can have totally different ways of directing their aggressiveness network, and there are lots of different ways of directing your aggression inside of these networks. There's no phylogenetic signal, which means that even closely related species can have totally different mechanisms of directing their aggression. And this figure has downwards heuristic, mostly undefined, pure bullying, mostly bullying, so it got a little finer here. Based on the computer was like, we're really, really sure that this is bullying versus this is mostly bullying. Pure close neighbor and mostly close neighbor. So this has a little bit of finer levels of distinction. But the important thing is to note is that even within like primates, you get a bunch of the different forms. Even within these elephants, you get a lot of the different forms. Passerines, you get almost all these different forms of directing aggression inside of these dominance hierarchies. So the relatedness of the species does not seem to be highly informative in determining what kinds of social dynamics occur within these dominance hierarchies in terms of directed aggression. And that makes sense because even within one species, you see such a diversity. Like a lot of them have interest-specific variation in these aggression heuristics. All right. Lastly, it's important, at least in some animal societies, to be able to reconcile when you have conflicts, right? So reconciliation in this case is usually from specific reconciliatory individuals. So after there's been a fight, you don't want to have heightened levels of aggression for very long times after that. So a lot of animal societies, or at least some primate societies, have individuals that specialize and allow in facilitating individuals that have engaged in recent conflict to overcome that and reestablish social bonds. So some species have evolved specific reconciliatory vocalizations to let them know that the other individuals you've had a conflict with know the fight is over, I'm not interested in continuing to fight, I'm going to make a specialized sound like grunting inside of olive baboons. And then there are special individuals that can help facilitate reconciliation after a conflict and resume stability. The interesting thing about this is that if you remove these specialized individuals that help in reconciliation, at least for some species of primate, levels of within group conflict and violence can increase tremendously. So reconciliation is an important process, and at least in some primates, and then in some species of primates, there are specialized individuals that help facilitate this process. They're like little conflict mediators, and oftentimes they're not that high ranking of individuals. They're just their role inside of the society. They specialize on it for many years, sometimes their whole lives. I mentioned previously in another lecture that we have sequential hermaphroditic clownfish, which have a sort of like a Russian doll series of body sizes. The largest individual in the anemone will be the only reproductive female. The second largest individual will be the only reproductive male, and every other male in the anemone is a proto-male that will have undeveloped testes, but have testes that are yet undeveloped. So the individuals of these anemone fish start off life as an egg in their maternal aquarium, in their maternal anemone. Then they have a pelagic long-term larval phase where after they've hatched and they're tiny little microfish, they float around all over the place in the environment in the water column, sequestering resources. Then they metamorphose into teeny tiny little protofish, and then they hide under the skirt of an anemone, i.e. the bottom of the anemone, that they will one day hope to occupy. most individual clownfish that are ever born from their egg, hatched from their egg, will never be a fish in this conga line to be reproductive inside of an anemone. Most individual anemone fish that recruit to the skirt of an anemone are going to wait in that skirt until they die. Why? Because everyone in that anemone is not able to grow as fast as they want. So there's a regulation here. The way that this species and the way several other species, some coral-dwelling goby, some cooperatively breeding cichlids in Africa have also evolved an ability to regulate their bodies, the development of their body size, to be able to suss out dominance hierarchies within a shared structure within the colony. So if you look at the largest individual inside this anemone, the only female, the next largest individual behind her will be almost exactly 80% of her size. And then that individual, the second largest individual, if you look at the third largest individual, the one just beneath them, they'll be exactly 80% of the body size of the second largest individual. And it goes down, 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 and little 20% decreases, all the way down to the smallest individual, who most recently metamorphosed from a tiny little larval fish, basically hiding out in the bottom of this anemone, hoping it doesn't starve to death, to the smallest male in the anemone, right? A proto-male, not reproducing. And how fast can they grow? They can only grow as fast as the individual in front of them in the conga line. And you might say, well, why isn't the individual just beneath this dominant individual or the individual in front of it in this dominance hierarchy, trying to grow as fast as it can? It can't. Because if it grows to 82% of the size of the individual in front of it in the anemone, it becomes a threat. It becomes so close in body size that it begins to threaten the individual in front of it. So each individual grows exactly at the same relative rate of the individuals in front of them to maintain this 80% size of the individual in front of them. Because if they get too close, if they try to grow quickly and imperil the rival in front of them, this conga line, they're forced out of the anemone by the individuals in front of them. And they just force them right out of the anemone, and they'll have a little standoff. So basically the way you do this experimentally is you take the individual fish out, you let it grow faster, and it will grow much faster outside of the anemone, and then you put it back into the anemone, and now it's 85% of the size of the individual in front of it. You just murdered that clownfish. So that clownfish now will be forced out of the anemone, and then all of its brood mates, well, they're not really brood mates because they're not relatives. All the clownfish inside this anemone, they're not related to each other. So they're not trying to help each other inside of this anemone. They're all just trying to live for as long as possible and become these dominant individuals at the top. Anyway, so they forced this cheater individual that tried to grow too quickly and imperil the individuals in front of it, they forced it out of the anemone. Bad news bears, guess what? Clownfish aren't such good swimmers. They are kind of a crappy swimmer, and they have to stay inside of these anemone, and otherwise they get picked off by predatory fish. A clownfish outside of an anemone that's been forced out might only last an hour, maybe 2 hours outside of the anemone. If you take a clownfish and you pull it out of an anemone far away into the water column and then just like let it swim back to its anemone across a couple of coral heads, it'll get eaten before it ever gets home, because they rely on these anemones for safety. And because they've evolved these anemones for safety for so long, they're really, really, really susceptible when they're outside of the anemone. So cheaters that try to grow too quickly get forced out. You can only grow as quickly as the individual in front of you in lockstep at that 80% size. If you grow too fast, you're gone. The only way that these clownfish ever reproduce, because 100% of the anemones that can be occupied are occupied by these clownfish. So you can't just go find another anemone to go like try to jump the line. Nope. There's already a line there. They've already got their 80% structure of those body sizes. And when you show up, you're going to fall outside of that conga line. You're going to be 92% of the size of the individual in front of you in that conga line, and they're going to get you killed. And you're probably going to die on the way there. Your only lot in life, if you're one of these clownfish, is you're basically locked in a cold war with every other clownfish around you, trying to just survive long enough to reproduce. So you start off life just hoping you don't starve to death, at the skirt of this anemone. You hope the individual in front of you in line, the smallest male inside that anemone, gets large enough that you can metamorphose and be 80% of their size. Because if they're too small, you can't metamorphose into being 90% of their size because they'll kill you. So you have to wait until that space opens up, that you can be 80% of the size of the next largest individual, and you can start the ascent of a proper clownfish that looks like a clownfish inside of this anemone. We used to think that these clownfish were like helping each other. They're friends. They're like fanning eggs and like removing some sort of parasites or something. That was all made up. None of that actually happens. It actually turns out none of these individuals that are not the female or the only reproductive male take any care of those eggs. And why would you want to take care of those eggs? Those aren't your eggs. Those aren't your relatives' eggs. Those are your rivals' eggs. You don't want to help them. Good God, if you help them, they might live longer. You want them to die. You want them to work hard and fuss with these eggs for as long as possible so that hopefully they'll get stressed, they'll get a disease, and they'll die so that you can ascend to the next position, grow fast, and replace them, right? Hopefully that top individual dies. So the average reef fish of this size, and these Indo-Pacific reefs where these clownfish are abundant, might only live to be 3 to 5 years old. How long do you think an anemone fish, a clownfish, can live? Super long time, because the only way that they are ever going to reproduce is to live long and hope your opponent dies. They're like little vampire fish, basically, just hoping that their rivals die. And so a clownfish can live to be 50 years old, 60 years old, 80 years old, many times longer than an individual reef fish. And that's because this Cold War of slowly waiting inside of these cooperative breeding, they're not even a cooperative breeding society because they're not really assisting each other, at least directly, in these little like dominance hierarchy societies, is to make sure that you live long enough in this queue so that one day you can be the largest individual. They have high survivorship as well. They're all protected in this anemone. Unless the anemone dies, they're all going to do quite well. And the anemones tend to have a high longevity as well. So why did I bring up this clownfish? I guess it's just such a neat notion of a dominance hierarchy that has forced by other animal society structure, forced the growth regulatory physiology of its group members to basically only get turned on, get activated when the social space in front of them allows them to grow. So they can't just grow free form. It's also interesting that basically being suppressed inside of this kind of animal society and the constraints that it imposes has caused not supernatural, but an extraordinary longevity that now these fish, which if they're close relatives ecologically, are only living a few years, but these fish can live decades and decades because the strength of evolution caused by this unique kind of dominance hierarchy has facilitated the evolution of longevity. And if your rivals can live a long time, then that means it pays for you to be able to live even longer. And it becomes an arms race of whoever can live the longest and endure inside of these anemones. And you, good God, don't help the individuals in front of you. You have to hope that they have a tragic slip. All right. I guess I'll end on the point that Finding Nemo is not a very biologically accurate movie. Because, in case you were wondering, because when Nemo's mother dies in the beginning of Finding Nemo, which most of you are now young enough that Finding Nemo probably was in movie theaters before you were born, I guess. Anyway, maybe you'll tell me. But his little single father fish would have turned into his mother. Nemo, who only had one working fin, would have turned into a reproductive male because there's only 2 of them inside of that aquarium and inside of that anemone. And then Nemo would have mated with his mother, who was once his father. And then if he had been abducted from some sort of evil ray, he would have lost the social cues that prevented him from Nemo from turning into a female clownfish, and so he would have metamorphosed into a female clownfish, and he probably would have grown much more rapidly for a little while, and then he would have come back to his home anemone where his once father, now mother, resides and probably has a new suite of consorts that she's mating with, and Nemo would have been forced out of the aquarium as a rival female, or at least out of the anemone as a rival female, and would have been picked off by some sort of predator, presumably much faster because he only had one functioning fin. So I think it would have made a much more interesting movie, personally. I hope they remake it. Anyway, enjoy yourselves. I think this is the end of our lecture, and we will talk to you about keystone individuals in the next lecture. And I think after that is complexity theory before we start the taxonomic march through all of animal life, after you've been equipped with all of these conceptual concepts to sort of like help contextualize them all. Anyway, take it easy. Have a good one. Bye. Oh, I'm still not turned off. Yeah.